we're back, or I'm back with another person, another wonderful guest. And I'm excited to talk to my friend. I've gotten to know her. I've known her a few years, but gotten to know her a lot better in the past year through a book group we're in together. But this is Bekah Mason. And Bekah is the executive director of the Revoice Conference. And if you don't know what that is, I'm going to ask her to talk a little bit about that later. And she's also a founding member of the Pelican Project, and she's a co-host of the Life on Side B podcast. And if you don't know what that means, we will also talk about that. So thank you so much. And Bekah is a longtime educator, and she's a person that really fosters empathetic conversation. So that's right. I wanted to bring her
Thank you
to this conversation today. So thanks for being here, Bekah.
Glad to be here. I'm excited to get to talk with you a little bit.
So do you have a question for me?
I do. Looking through your book, there was this passage that jumped out at me in the introduction, which I always want to remind people, if you skip the introductions in books, don't do that, because there's so much rich stuff in the introduction. But this passage where you talk about Christian empathy being self-sacrificial and intentional, it's on page 3, right at the beginning. It says, we fail to love God when we neglect to see and cherish the imago Dei in other human beings. And that, like, in the weeks since I first read it, that has continued to kind of resonate with me, that idea of not just seeing and acknowledging the image of God in people, but being able to cherish it. What does that look like for you as the author who put that beautiful sentence together? What does cherishing the imago Dei in somebody else look like for you?
Wow. I mean, I think I use the word intentional. I think it's a very natural tendency within ourselves to just label and dismiss people, and just to, oh, they're that way, they're that type of group. I mean, that's just, we gravitate towards that, it's kind of like the high school clique mentality, but it's like kind of always in our brains. And
right.
So I think to cherish is to just really see the sacred being of another person. Mm-hmm. And you kind of have to, I mean, you have to, I would say that would connect with a kind of slowing down, being, listening, watching, participating. And again, we can do that in personal conversation. We can do that. That's why through the arts, I mean, it's an act of love to read a 500-page novel about a Sudanese refugee, which what is the what right. is one of the books I talk about, to really allow yourself to kind of, they invite you into their mind and their story. And then when you spend the time of seeing that person's experience, we can't really see it from inside out, but that's about as close as we can get. And that can help us to see, really cherish and honor the image of God, mainly by listening and by slowing down, I would say.
I love that. Yeah. We've got that idea of, I know, almost in a dismissive sort of tone. I think especially for those of us that have a little more of a reformed bent, because we are so quick to recognize the depravity of humanity, that tends to become our default of, they're the image of God, but it's so broken or so marred by sin or so whatever. And so that idea of cherishing it really kind of flips it on its head, of helping us see that needs to be our primary focus when we are dealing with the lives and souls of our fellow human beings, that imago Dei needs to be our primary focus and not everything else that can sometimes get in the way and crowd it out. So I love that you phrased it like that.
Oh, thank you. I don't even remember that phrasing, but and I'm like, what does that mean? I don't know. But I mean, it really comes into play when we the idea of like of really seeing that in our enemies. That's the hardest. Or with someone, I mean, it's a defense mechanism to label and dismiss someone. You're protecting yourself. And this is asking us to be vulnerable, to
Yeah.
take time to see another person as human. I remember I heard someone a few years ago speak at Lee University Chapel, and she was high up in the military, or she had been, and she said, when they went training for battle, they said, we're taught not to see the other person as a human, but as an enemy.
Yeah.
And so it's that kind of Martin Buber, I thou, I it, that the idea that
Right.
if you can turn the other person into an it and be distant from them, then it's easier to ignore them or
Right.
even harm them. But if you kind of bring them up close, whether that's through hearing their story or just spending time, listening to them face to face, I think it does soften us.
Oh
But
yeah.
we are, I don't know, we don't tend to be a very patient society. That takes patience and grace
Exactly.
and compassion. So yeah.
Yeah, and that vulnerability you're talking about. I mean, empathy is an expression of vulnerability, and it's scary.
It is. And well, I wanted to ask you to tell us about Revoice, because I feel like Revoice is a community that really is inviting empathy for
Yeah.
a particular community. And I know when I haven't been in person, but when I've watched from the Revoice conference, I was just so touched and just moved, and really wanted to know this community, wanted to be part of this community. So could you tell us a little bit about, a little bit about Revoice?
Yeah, sure. And that makes me excited to hear, because that really is part of our goal, is not to create an isolating us versus them
Yes.
community, which often our critics accuse us of doing, of we're going to come over here by ourselves in this isolated little group and worship God together. That our goal is to bring people together, that the church that recognizes a theology of the body that encourages a more conservative viewpoint on sexuality, sex, and marriage, has often shown a lack of empathy towards people who experience same-sex attraction, and especially those who identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual within that, as being outcast from their communities of faith. And
Mm-hmm.
so our goal is to help really establish that type of empathy within the church, so that those who are same-sex attracted, who identify as gay, who want to remain in a biblically orthodox traditional understanding of a theology of the body and of sex and marriage, will be able to stay and flourish and have a place at the table. And so it's not isolating as much as it is welcoming, that we want straight people and queer people and people of color and the majorities and minorities, no matter what your perspective may be on all of those types of cultures, want to be able to create a space where those people can come together around what should be the focus, which is celebrating Christ and his ability to bring people together, that fundamentally in our broken humanity, that we are going to say we have nothing to do with one another. That ideally someone could walk into a church and say, there is nothing that should bring this diverse group of people together, and we can say, except for the blood of Christ. And so what we want Revoice to be is a model of that, of everyone being able to come together and to worship Jesus and to be fully integrated and welcome and a part of that body and community. And we talk about modeling that for the church, so that eventually my goal is to work myself out of a job, that churches will be so good at integrating single people into families, of being able to bring everyone together in a way that is not discounting or dismissing the nuclear family, but is simply broadening the picture of what family looks like, which is really what Jesus does in Scripture. And so that's our goal with the conference and with our community groups and pastoral training, is to help churches be able to do that in their congregations as we model it in our annual conference.
Wow. And thank you. I mean, it is amazing work and amazing ministry. And I've learned so much from you and from others, the conference. But I'm also thinking about how hard it is, um, because, well, can you explain what side B? I mean, you've already kind of hit on it, but just
Yeah,
the podcast that you co-host is Life on Side B. And
right.
so Voice is focusing on Side B Christians, their experience, but maybe just clarify again what that is.
Sure. It started out as kind of an insider term within Christian gay communities that side A and side B goes from talking traditionally about albums, you have a side A and a side B of a record. That side A has always was coined as a description of Christians who are affirming of gay marriage, that are fully welcoming in to the idea of same-sex attracted and gay people being able to engage in same-sex relationships. Side B, on the other hand, is the smaller, lesser known group, kind of the backside of your album, of people who hold to the fact of, I'm attracted to the same sex. I may even identify as gay, but I believe that God has a specific purpose for sex, sexuality, and marriage that images something that requires the difference of male and female within that practice of sex and marriage. And so they want to hold to that and are committed to that in a way that either commits themselves to lifelong celibacy or to be in a part of what now is called mixed orientation marriage, of someone who's gay or same-sex attracted, usually being married to someone who we would identify as being straight. So that's side B. And then there are other groups that have kind of picked up on that side terminology. Side Y tends to be people that will not use the terminology of gay or bi or a lesbian, but will acknowledge an ongoing struggle with same-sex attraction. Side X are those who view it as something that has been completely rejected, they've turned away from, they no longer recognize or acknowledge any sort of connection to gay life or gay lifestyle, or even talking about same-sex attraction. It's simply a part of who they were before they knew Christ, or just any other sin struggle. And it's not something that they choose to talk about publicly or often even within their church families. So that there is a lot of generality in those terms, but that tends to be kind of an insider conversation. If you hear people using those shorthand terms, that's basically what they're talking about.
Yeah, wow, that's a great, clear, and helpful description. I'm just thinking about how I've seen so much of the conversation around Revoice and around Side B Christians, and I feel like the Side B Christians are there's often a real lack of empathy for that community, because
Yeah.
you have the affirming, gay affirming, who really are not happy with them, thinking you're not going far enough. And then there are
Right.
the more kind of conservative Christians that are just like, I mean, because your conference has gotten a lot of criticism as it's a slippery
Yeah.
slope, so I just can only imagine being in the middle with people on both sides thinking that you aren't doing the right thing, living the right
Yeah.
way. So what would you suggest how would you suggest um having empathy for both sides there, like even for if someone even who doesn't identify as gay is wanting to get in conversations about that, encourage people in churches like that to really create a space for a Side B
Yeah.
Christian. I mean, what sort of suggestions might you have?
Um, Honestly, I would suggest for starters at this point that they read your book. Because just to turn it around and plug it back for launch day, because it does such a great job of helping us understand a Christian theology of hospitality and of empathy, that it's not simply we talked about empathy even getting a bad rap, that we're not supposed to feel the feelings of other people or step into how they feel. But you do such a great job of explaining that that is literally what Jesus does as he
Yeah.
empties himself and puts on humanity in order to be able to understand where we are. That idea of looking at hospitality, of understanding that we have to make space for people,
Yeah.
that it's not just you figure out where to jump into the machine we already have running, but how can we intentionally make space for you within the body and the congregation that we currently have. So getting a more robust understanding of what hospitality means, that
Mm,
it's not just, hey, the door's open, come on in and make yourself at home, that it's we are going to make sure you feel at home. And
yeah.
that's a very different perspective. That is really the first thing that I encourage pastors and counselors, people that are asking, how can we do this in our church? Is making sure that you're not just saying, here, jump in, but you're literally making a space where there wasn't one previously, to ensure that people understand that they're not just tolerated, but they are literally welcome, and that you want to bring them into the community, not just a give or take kind of feeling about them, but we are incomplete without you here. And that's a very different perspective.
Ooh, I like that. That really, yeah, we are incomplete without you here. Like you are
Yeah,
adding something unique and important.
exactly.
I mean, it also makes me think of just how single people in the church in general, how
Right.
they are the often overlooked. There's a side little,
Exactly.
okay, well, here's I don't know. It's just everything is so focused
College and
on,
career. Yeah.
yeah, like, but if you get past a certain age, it's like,
Exactly. Like,
whatever. So yeah, that's a really tough one. But I love the idea of making space, which
yeah.
I was kind of referencing, or Making Room, I think is the book by Christina Pohl's book that's about, Christian hospitality.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but do you think, well, I want to ask you, if I'm just thinking about making room and relating that to our interaction with the arts, and how,
Yeah.
again, kind of taking time to read or watch something, especially uh, uh, focusing on someone who has a very different life experience than ours,
Yeah.
is an act of love. And so
Right.
I want to ask you, is there a work of art? I mean, this is always a hard, because it's like nobody wants to choose one, but we know there are many. But
Yeah.
can you think of one? It can be film, a novel, any work of art that you can look back and say that really helped open up my capacity for empathy.
Oh, the most recent, I would say, what was actually the TV show Pose that was on FX for several years,
Oh,
about the transgender community in New York City in the 80s and early 90s. That it was startling for me, especially to think, oh, this entire story about drag queens and what this looked like, how this community existed, um, because they were rejected from every other community they were in,
mm,
was a probably the most intense, most recent experience I've had of developing empathy for a specific group and a culture, because it really is its own culture. But helping me understand that places like that exist and are created and have unbelievable art and dance and music and dress and culture. um, Oftentimes those people have come together around this idea of um, collective suffering, because
mm,
they've been thrown out of their homes, they've been rejected from their churches. And that was a one of the sub threads throughout the series, was tracing one particular character's struggle and kind of redemption, reconciliation with his own faith, of how he had struggled with sexuality in a church setting and had been rejected by his family and the church, and how before the end of his life was able to come to some sort of peace in reckoning with that struggle. just a reminder also of how the lack of empathy within the church leads to that sort of rejection and suffering. That the conviction for me was, I don't ever want myself, I don't ever want a congregation that I'm a part of to be the reason someone else experiences suffering in such a way that they have to go find that family and that community somewhere other than the church. The church should be the place where any misaligned, otherwise rejected, marginalized person can come in and find unconditional love and community. Those other types of chosen family environments are generally created to take the space that the church is meant to fill. And it was just confirmation for me of a lot of study and research I've been doing recently on the idea of chosen family, that it's the church's failure to do that that has caused chosen family to be found elsewhere. And so Pose is one of the most recent ones for me. Just phenomenal acting and directing and camera work in general, but that's one that struck me in developing a greater sense of empathy for a marginalized people.
Yeah, I've heard about that and remember wanting to watch it, but now I'm
Yeah,
thinking I need to. And do you think it's chosen? I know the idea of chosen family. We often talk about that, or that's often used with talking about LGBT community, like a kind of surrogate
right.
family. You're rebuilt.
Yeah,
But do you see? I know you've worked with multiple communities, like also abuse survivors of different types. I'm just thinking, I'm also thinking about when I was in high school, because I just talked about this with Ken and Byron and punk rock friends, and how that is its
yeah,
own kind of surrogate, community to some degree.
right.
So have you seen that in other contexts, like, or is it mainly something that you've studied related to the LGBT community?
Oh no, we see that a lot in many different communities. I mean, it's been most closely adopted by the LGBT community because so many have been literally rejected from their nuclear families. But you see that in any sort of group that finds itself pushed together because they're in a minority in a situation. So you see a lot of that in expat communities overseas, that
Mm,
all the Americans find one another. And that's the one unifying thing that you
mm,
have, is you're in a different nationality, a different culture from what you were raised in. We see it in survivors, women especially, that are coming out of like cultish patriarchal systems, that they have experienced intense amounts of abuse, that they finally leave the abusive situation in their churches and turn excommunicate them.
mm.
Those women tend to establish their own chosen family networks, either online or in groups locally, to be able to support one another and to provide that support and encouragement and um, just sharing life together, that the church is usually the one that provides that for them. In their situations, they're having to find it because they've been rejected by the church,
Yeah.
or what they understood as being church. So being able to find those situations where anytime you have people that there's something that sets them apart from the majority culture around them, we tend to find one another. And whatever is our common denominator is what brings us together. And
Yes.
so being able to find that even within smaller groups within the church, and then being able to pull that together of the unifying thing that brings us together, is our imago Dei and our trust and understanding in the
Mm.
good news of Jesus being the thing that unites us together in the church.
Wow, that's powerful.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much, Becca. That kind of sums it
You're
all up.
welcome.
That kind of sums it all up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I'm gonna bring it to a close.
All
And
right.
I just thank you so much for this chat. I
Yeah,
mean, I could just, talk all day with each of these wonderful folks. But yeah, check out, if you're not familiar with Revoice or Life on Side B, checks those things out. And I'm sure Becca would be open for conversation about
absolutely.
all
Would
of
love
this.
it.
So thank you.
All right. Thanks, Mary. Take care.
Okay, I gotta